Poppy by Avi. Chapter 18, The Battle. Ragweed's earrings saved her. So powerful, so swift was Mr. Oakcock's descent that he pushed a wave of air before him and caused the earring to flutter. The flutter felt like a little tap of a tiny finger on Poppy's ear. She felt it and whirled, and at the last possible second, she saw the owl coming and made a leap to safety. The next minute, however, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had leaped not back among the corn, but further onto the open road. Mr. Oakcock was now on the ground, blocking her way to the field. She spun towards the forest, and in a second the owl was in the air and down on the other side. Once again, he had blocked her way. "Ha ha! Not so smart as all of that, are you?" he sneered. "Well, I don't compromise with what I want," he told her, "and what I want is you never getting home alive." He made a sudden darting movement to the left. Poppy jumped to the right, but Mr. Oakcock was ahead of her. Just as quickly, he had shifted back towards her so that Poppy was forced to halt herself clumsily. There she stood, flat-footed, panting, not sure which way to go. The owl, towering over her, laughed. "Ha! I told you what would happen if I caught up with you again, didn't I? But this time, you won't have that fat porcupine to help you." So saying, he made a snap at her with his beak. Mr. Oakcock's mention of earth was the reminder Poppy needed. She reached down and yanked the quill from her sash, then held it up before her like a sword. At first, Mr. Oakcock blinked. Then he snickered. "Ha! You don't think one of his quills is going to stop me, do you?" "That owl on the barn," Poppy panted between hard breathing, "is just a fake. You've been frightened by a fake owl." Mr. Oakcock's beak dropped open. He hesitated, and that moment Poppy sensed she could have gotten away, but she could not resist another taunt. "You're not an owl, you're a chicken," she said in triumph. And for an instant the two of them, owl and mouse, confronted each other. Then a terrible rage passed across the owl's face. Poppy knew then she'd made another blunder. She'd lost her momentary chance of escape. Now there was nothing he'd not do to kill her. She would have to fight him. Trembling, she flourished the quill in response. Mr. Oakcock spread his wings, then beat down hard with them upon the road. That threw up a cloud of dust. It was hard for Poppy to breathe, much less see. She took a step back, only to hear a sound behind her. Confused, she turned. Hidden by the dust, Mr. Oakcock had overleaped the road. Once again, he was behind her. From there, he made a slash at her with his beak. Poppy stuck out the quill. Seeing the quill and realizing the danger to his eyes, the owl pulled back. He glared at Poppy. He snapped his beak. Poppy stared back, grim-faced, gasping for breath, waving the quill before her. "If it takes the whole night, I'll wear you down," Mr. Oakcock hissed. "All it takes is one mistake on your part, then you're done. Finished." He made a forward feint. Poppy danced nimbly back. Mr. Oakcock struck again. This time it was not with his beak, but with his talons. Poppy, quill up, dodged the talons with a quick sidestep, but she knew her only hope was to get into the corn and hide. Otherwise, the owl would overpower her. Making sure of her footing, she began to back towards the forest. Just as she had hoped, Mr. Oakcock leaped up and landed between her and the trees. It was then that she raced for the corn. Mr. Oakcock was just as fast. Grasping her strategy, he barely touched earth when he took off, flying hot forward to block her way. He advanced wildly now, snapping and snarling. In response, Poppy slashed wildly with the quill. Once she stuck out at the owl's face, but it only hit his feathers. Though the blow glanced off harmlessly, it served to infuriate him. Mr. Oakcock, closing in, darted his head in and out, side to side. Poppy was bewildered. Then the owl turned briefly away from her, and in a flash she made a successful rolling dive under his wing. She was behind Mr. Oakcock at last on the corn side of the road. She started to run. He turned his head in a complete half circle, saw her, and spun his whole body about. His right wing extended full length. The wingtip struck Poppy, glancing a blow to her head. Down she tumbled and landed on her back in the dust. Seizing his advantage, Mr. Ocox pounced, beak open, tongue out, hissing. Poppy whipped the air with the quill. The tip of it pricked the owl's tongue. He screamed in rage and reeled back. Poppy had just time enough to regain to her feet. Once more, she faced him, quill at the ready. Mr. Ocox stung, pressed forward, now this way, now that, head bobbing, weaving, viciously snapping with his beak. Increasingly exhausted, Poppy was forced to give ground. She crumbled to her knees. In that moment, the owl had been waiting for, and with a powerful kick, he thrust his left claw, talons spread wide at Poppy's head. Poppy saw the claw coming, using all of her strength to grip the quill. She held it up with both paws to protect herself and jabbed it into Mr. Ocox's claw as it came down. The owl gave a great squawk, fell back, and began to roll about violently. Fearful of losing the quill, her only weapon, Poppy pulled on it with all of her might, but the barbs had caught. She could not get the quill loose. She was being dragged and bumped along. Mr. Ocox, screeching and flapping his wings wildly, flailed into the air, and before Poppy knew what was happening, she too was in the air. She did tell herself to let go of the quill, but the time the thought was whole, and it was too late. To drop from that height Mr. Ocox had clearly reached, meant to fall to her death. There was nothing to do but to hang on. Mr. Ocox, squawking, hissing, flew like one possessed. Up and down and around he went, making loops, dives, climbing, twisting, anything and everything to work the quill from his claw. But the more he flexed, the more he twisted, the more the barbs worked into them, into his claws, causing ever more excruciating pain. Poppy hung on. The fact that Mr. Ocox was dragging a claw, from that claw dangled a mouse, greatly impeded his flying. His flight path became increasingly wild. In his desperate desire to rid himself of pain, Mr. Ocox ceased to look where he was heading. Violently, he plunged towards the cornfield. Once over it, he lowered his left claw, and at that moment, Poppy, deliberately thumping along the corn stalks in the hope that the quill would be jerked out, Poppy was being battered. But each time she decided to release her hold on the quill, the owl surged forward, causing her to cling to it more convulsively than ever. Knowing she would not be able to take much more, Poppy tried to see what was ahead. Mr. Ocox was skimming low over the corn tops, but when he passed beyond them, he dropped towards the ground. "Let go," Poppy told herself. "Let go!" But she was feeling so groggy, her own muscles weren't responding. Then she saw what the owl was aiming for, the salt lick. And he was picking up speed. In his madness, he was preparing to strike his claw on that. Poppy had wits enough to sense that if she struck that hard salt, it would be the end for her. "Let go," she cried to herself again. This time she did. Down she plummeted. As she did, Mr. Ocox first rose, then dropped, totally out of control. He slammed into the salt lick head-on. So great was the blow that the salt shattered while the owl went tumbling head over tail in an explosion of feathers. After 3 flips, he anonymously flopped down like a sack of potatoes onto the ground. As for Poppy, she landed on grass. For a moment, she lay there stunned, battered, confused. She looked up into the sky but saw nothing. Then she looked across the lawn and she saw him. Mr. Ocox lay on his back, perfectly still. His claws were drawn up over his chest, slightly curled. The quill still stuck out from the left one. Scattered among the feathers were chunks of salt. Poppy stumbled to her feet. She took a wobbly step or two towards the cornfield. Then she stopped and looked back. Mr. Ocox had not moved. She stared at him. Slowly, not sure if she should believe what she was thinking, she crept closer to the fearsome owl. And after a few steps, she paused, looked, sniffed. Still, there was no movement. Close to Mr. Ocox's head now, Poppy stopped again. The great Owl's eyes were wide open, staring up into the sky. His devil-like tufts of feathers were bent. His beak was open. As Poppy watched, it snapped listlessly. Mr. Ocox? No answer. She took a step closer. Mr. Ocox? His head turned slightly, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus on her. Sometimes, he muttered. Sometimes I wonder why I bother to protect you. And with that, his beak made a final clack shut. His eyes closed. Poppy knew it then. Mr. Ocox was no longer alive.